Hello, happy Sabbath. How are you all? Tonight I continue to pray to our good Lord to protect us all and to bless us with love, joy, and peace. And may His presence be here and guide us as we study chapter 20 of Exodus. Tonight we're going to talk about the 10 Commandments. Begin with the first 4. You know, we often isolate God's law, the law given at Mount Sinai, with the rest of the Exodus story, chapters 1 through 19. So what do I mean? Well, if you have been following the narrative, you notice that God delivered His people first, forgave them first, provided for them, prior to here in chapter 20, giving them the law. God was fulfilling His promise of blessings, allowing His people to know who He is before He gave them the laws. Last week we mentioned the power of God transforms people, but transformation also depends on our acceptance of His laws, which is His covenant of restoration, which we're going to talk about tonight. But tonight we're going to start with the first 4, as I mentioned. Now let's go to verse 1. Verse 1 is very short. It says, "Then God spoke all these words." Well, these are the only commands that God has spoken to the people directly. And here, the verse 1, God is emphasizing that. And we see later on that God even wrote these commands on 2 tablets of stone by Himself. And then later on, after the tabernacle system was established, these laws were deemed so important that they put them inside the Ark of Covenant, underneath God's mercy seat for preservation. Now let's go to verse 2 and 3. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You must have no other gods before me." This is the first commandment. An opening of this command reminded the people that He delivered them from their oppressor and that He has no equals. He is the only God. So to sustain the freedom they had just obtained, they must have no other gods. So how does this command apply to us? For us, God also has delivered us from our oppressor, the accuser Satan. And to sustain this freedom, we must have no other gods. So what kind of gods do we have today? What kind of false god we have in this modern era? I read that there are thousands of gods that people worship today. Besides gods made of material things, we also have false gods of entertainment, pleasure, fame, money, power, selfishness, and instant gratification. All these lead us and our children away from God. Now let's go to verse 4 to 6. "Do not make an idol for yourself, no form whatsoever, of anything in the sky above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow down to them or worship them, because I, the Lord your God, am a passionate God. I punish children for their parents' sin, even to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me. But I'm loyal and gracious to the 1000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandment." So another version of the Bible, instead of said, "I am the Lord your God, am a passionate God," is a jealous God. Okay, we'll go into that in a little bit. Well, this is the second commandment. In the ancient days, people make statues or images of God's creations. They observe things like the sea and the sun that exudes mighty forces. And so they thought, well, they are so powerful, so they must be deities and worthy to be worshipped. And here God told them not to make images or gods out of his creations, and don't bow down to them. So how did all this veneration of idols begin? You see, when the ancient people experienced hardship or feeling out of control, they wanted to seek help from something that is tangible to them, something that symbolized power. And so they felt that they could get help and protection from this powerful creation of God, and they worship them. But in this commandment, God said not to make an idol for ourselves, no form whatsoever, or anything in the sky above, or the earth below, or in the water under the earth. Don't bow down to them or worship them. That was very clear, right? You know, the Protestant reformer Martin Luther summarized this command. He said we are to fear, love, and trust God above anything else. And then the second half of this command is, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. The Hebrew translation of the word punishing for the sin is literally visiting the guilt of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. What this means is the moral repercussion of idolatry can stick to family for several generations. But in contrast, loving God and obeying him will be loved by God for time eternal. And we know which one is the best choice, right? Obviously. And the Hebrew word love here is kasia, meaning unrelenting love or steadfast love. So what about the jealous of God that is mentioned here? Does God get jealous like human beings? Human jealousy is mostly negative. So is God's jealousy the same? Well, we have to look at the context of the book of Exodus. God came down, delivered his people, guided them, provided for them, but in response, they brought the gods to Aaron, who in turn make a golden calf for them. And they said, this is your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. You see, they betrayed God. So God's jealousy is not like human jealousy. It is grounded on truth. And it requires humans who are created and redeemed to tell the truth about their experience and not put themselves or other things as our Redeemer and Creator. In this modern days, the Roman Catholic, and particularly the Orthodox churches, continue to revere icons of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the apostles. Why doesn't God want men and women to make statues to remember him and other Christian figures? Well, there is nothing in this world or imagination can capture all of God. In making idols or shrines, men and women have a false conception of God and his attributes. We serve the true God that is revealed in his word, that is revealed in Christ, and also in nature. And we do not adore anything that is made or imagined and to enshrine them in the place of God. Well, let's look at what Paul said. This is in Romans 1:23-24. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images that look like mortal humans, birds, animals, and reptiles. So God abandoned them to their heart's desires, which led to the moral corruption of degrading their own bodies with each other's. So, from a book titled We Become What We Worship, Greg Beale said, idols are a twisted version of reality. Whenever we worship a created object, a person, or animal, we are acting unnaturally towards the Creator. And through this unnatural worship of a created thing, the life of the worshiper takes on increasingly unnatural characteristic as well. And that unnatural character is reflected in unnatural sexual desire, sexual sin that Paul later describes. So now let's go to verse 7. Do not use the Lord your God's name as if it were of no significance. The Lord won't forgive anyone who uses his name that way. This is telling the people to remember who had delivered them from bondage, and that God's reputation is tied to their deliverance. The usage of God's name should be in a positive way, declaring his work of grace and redemption. People also use the Lord's name as a means of swearing to tell the truth in court, right? And therefore corrupting the legal process by lying will be a kind of violation of this command as well. Let's read two other passages that dealt with this matter. Deuteronomy 6:13. You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him, and shall take oath in his name. Leviticus 19:12. And you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So Deuteronomy said that you can take oath in God's name, but then in Leviticus said that when you swear in God's name, you shouldn't falsely use his name, because you're going to profane the name of God. And again, the reformer Martin Luther said, we are to fear and love God so that we don't use his name superstitiously as well, or to use it to curse people, or to swear, to lie, or to deceive, but use his name to call on him in prayer, praise, and thanksgiving. Now verse 8 until verse 11. This is the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day and treat it as holy. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work on it, not you, your sons or daughter, your male or female servants, your animals, or the immigrant who is living with you. Because the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything that is in them in 6 days, but rested on the seventh day. And that is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. There are 5 observations about the Sabbath, and I hope after the explanation, you will gain a little bit more depth about this command. I'm sure you've noticed there are quite a bit of misunderstanding about the fourth commandment. First observation. For the Israelites, Sabbath distinguishes them from the surrounding nations. How so? When God's worshiper worshiping him on this day, denotes they have separated themselves from idolatry and connecting themselves with the true God, because they recognize and remember what he has done for them. God designed the observance of this day for his worshiper, and he said, remember the Sabbath day. The commandment begins with remember, knowing that someday his people will forget. Second observation. Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, and it means rest. A few chapters back, if you remember, the people were running out of food and they complained to Moses, and God sent them manna. And along with giving the manna, God had given them instructions. He told them to gather sufficient manna every day. Just one day, don't get it for the next day. But on Friday, they will gather twice as much, because on Sabbath, Saturday, there will be no manna given. So the lesson from that instruction we learned is not only God wanted his people to have physical rest on Sabbath, but he also wanted them to trust him. Trust that he is the one who provides for them, that they can survive without working on the seventh day. So there's a trust element in observing the Sabbath. Third observation, the Sabbath day belongs to the Lord, because the commandment said, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So the Sabbath day belongs to the Lord, and it is a day of blessing, implying that to rest is to share in the life of God, who also rested. Moreover, Sabbath is a day of memorial of creation, which I've already mentioned. So it is a sign of God's power and his love. Fourth observation, it is a spiritual rest for believers. The book of Deuteronomy chapter 5, the 10 Commandments was reiterated there. And over there, the Sabbath was to remember God is the deliverer who has delivered his people from bondage. So for his believers, remembering the Sabbath is also to remember his deliverance. Christ is our deliverer. He delivers us from sin, the bondage of sin, and our salvation rested on him. Fifth observation, the Sabbath command is also for the servants, animals, and immigrants. They also need rest, right? And someone said the Sabbath law is the greatest worker protection act in history. Unfortunately, many thought the law of Sabbath was done away with and no longer necessary to observe. They thought the 7-day Sabbath was for the Jews only. Do you know the Sabbath was given prior to Mount Sinai? It was a gift for Adam and Eve, a Garden of Eden. Therefore, Sabbath observance was prior to Abraham, prior to Moses and Mount Sinai, and prior to the establishment of the Jewish nation. Adam and Eve celebrated the first Sabbath with God. That was even before sin had entered the world. So my question would be, why God abolish the Sabbath? Why would he do that? Well, some said Jesus came and he had already fulfilled the law, and therefore there's no need to observe that day, the seventh day. Well, they were partly right. However, if you study both the Old Testament and New Testament, you see that there are sets of laws in Old Testament. The moral laws, ceremonial laws, civil laws, and health laws. The latter two will talk about it on another day. Moral law is the 10 Commandments, which teaches us, men and women, the distinction between right and wrong. And the ceremonial law prefigures Christ. In this ceremonial laws, there were instructions for cleansing and purification when people have sinned and not in the right standing with God. And these are the rituals that point to the Lamb of God who taketh away the sin of the world. So God's Son became a man and died on the cross for sinners, fulfilling all the ceremonial laws. Therefore, this law becomes redundant and no longer need to be observed. And now we clarify that it is not the moral law that we're done away with. If the fourth commandment were done away with or abrogated at the cross, why only the fourth commandment and not the rest of the 9 commandments, like thou shalt have no other gods before me, and thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, etc., be done away with? You see my point? There are also people who think the Sabbath had been transferred to Sunday, the first day of the week. But you see, the Sabbath was established at creation. It was there prior to man's fallen to sin. Let's look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 to 3, Mark 2, 27, and Job 38, 4 and 7. Genesis 2, 2 to 3, by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And Job, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Mark, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for them, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. In these passages, we can see what I had mentioned earlier, that Sabbath was created in the very beginning. The 7th day was set aside and declared holy. Furthermore, it was a day of celebration. The angels shouted for joy. In Mark 2:27, which is the last passage that I read, many people misunderstood and thought Jesus was telling the people that Sabbath observance was no longer necessary because he was allowing his disciples to violate the Sabbath. And this was not Jesus' intention. He was merely refuting the Pharisees' charge that his disciple was breaking the Sabbath by plucking raw ears of grain. Well, actually the disciples were very hungry and they were just trying to relieve their hunger. And so in this instant, and also when Jesus healed those who were sick on Sabbath, his intention was not teaching the people that Sabbath was no longer important. He was merely clarifying the purpose of Sabbath. Besides the above passages that I read, you can also read the book of Acts, which is a record of the disciples' ministry after Jesus' ascension. And you'll notice the disciples continue to observe the Sabbath. So with these evidence, I believe Sabbath has not been nullified just because Jesus has fulfilled his messianic role in human history. But instead, the Sabbath has been clarified and enriched by his teaching and his redemptive ministry. Neither did he change the Sabbath day to the first day of the week. There is no indication of it anywhere in the Bible. Summary. What are God's reasons in giving the laws? Number 1, the Israelites were free from the bondage of Pharaoh, and now God is trying also to free them from the bondage of sin. The laws are to protect them from becoming slaves again. The law is to sustain their freedom. Man can be slave to sin. You know that, right? And the main purpose of the law is salvation. chapter 1 to 19 of Exodus is the foundation of what is happening at chapter 20. Number 2, God gave the people laws so that they will remember. The future generation will also remember that they were a free people because they were delivered by God. And they will also remember they have this special structure of order that is above all the other nations because they were obedient to laws given by God. Number 3, God is building a new community, and these laws are the structure and framework of order for the people. Number 4, the giving of the laws was God's second act of creation. The first creation separated chaos and order. And the second act of creation is separating the right and the wrong. Oftentimes we think negatively of God's commandments. But if you will examine them carefully, the thou shalt nots are actually setting positive outer boundaries that secure the safety and health of individuals and community. Therefore, the aims of God's commandment are to restrict the evil forces and tendency that threatens to destroy healthy freedom in a society. We notice that today men and women have reversed what God had commanded. Coveting is our priority. We expect sexual license, ignore extended family, and view God as irrelevant. Well, I hope with this lesson we understand, God's commandment is for our own good. It is not restricting, but it gives us freedom. Freedom from the bondage of sin. Happy Sabbath.